One of the questions that I so often get asked about is when to divide my hostas. And a general rule for herbaceous perennials is if your plants bloom in the spring, you divide them in the fall. If they bloom in the fall, you divide them in the spring. And if they bloom in the summer, no, you don't divide them in the winter time. You can divide them either in the spring or the fall. And since hostas bloom in the summertime, we can choose whether we want to divide them in the spring or the fall. Now, typically the fall is the best time because you're not going to cut up this plant and then push it into the heat of the summer. But a lot of times we get excited as gardeners and we want to go ahead and start dividing and propagating our plants. Perhaps you might have bought one at the nursery, like this 5-gallon one. That's a pretty big one, and want to stretch your dollar a little bit further. Well, you can still divide this in the springtime and go ahead and plant it. So we've got one here. This is a Halcyon cultivar, and this is an old cultivar but a goodie. It has this blue foliage to it, and it's really a textured ribbed leaf. And actually, it's one of the cultivars that will hold the blue foliage a little bit longer than some of the more other ones that you might see on the market. Now, this particular cultivar gets to be about 14 inches, but will almost double in size once it starts blooming with a lilac flower that will reach about 26 inches tall. So we're going to look at this one. And this one, just last week, it just had little buds coming up and it's already started to leaf out. So this is probably the latest that you would really want to divide it in the springtime. But we're going to go ahead and take it out of its pot here. And start looking at where we need to make those cuts. Now, it kind of depends on what your objective is with dividing a hosta. We're going to give it a gentle pull here to try to get it out. You see it's got a nice root system on it. It's not root bound, but just has good roots to it. Right here we can look through there and almost see that there is a nice division between some of these plants, some of these crowns. So we're going to cut through that. Now again, typically the nice thing about doing it in the spring before it's got too much foliage is it allows you to kind of see where to divide that plant better so than in the fall when it's completely leafed out. So we're going to just use our hand saw and cut right through this. It's almost like dividing ornamental grasses, just basically cutting it through division. So I'm going to take our saw and just cut right through here. So we've got it divided in half now, but looking at this, I think I can go ahead and divide it into a third by cutting it right in between here. Now really, hostas don't need division a lot. This cultivar again is actually a fairly sizable clump, and it'll take some time to regrow this good sized clump. It's a fairly slow growing cultivar. So you want to keep that in mind. We're cutting this knowing that it's going to take some time to reestablish these large clumps. But again, we're going to have 3 clumps now to work with to put in our garden. So before you attack a hosta, you want to think about how many you want to get out of it. Again, we could divide this even further if we wanted to get more. But for our purpose here, we're just going to take these 3 sizable clumps, yet smaller, and we'll be able to grow 3 larger clumps eventually. As you approach dividing your hosta, you want to think about how many you might want to get out of it. Because again, we've only got 3 plants here. You could divide this more, but every time you divide it, you're reducing the amount of leaf and also root volume. And as you do that, that means it's going to take longer for each one of those individual plants to grow back and to become that large clump. Now, as you do this, you can also think about whether you want several plants to scatter around your garden or you want to create that bold look of one big hosta plot. If you want that bold look, but you've divided your hostas, something you might consider doing is spacing them appropriately, but spacing them together. So here we've got 3 of the same cultivar, and if we plant them about 2 feet apart, we're going to have a nice patch of this Halcyon hosta right here in a couple of years. Most hostas don't need dividing that often. In fact, if you've noticed that it's been growing pretty well for several years, you can leave it if you would like. You can divide it if you want more plants to share around your garden or share with friends. But also you might look at the foliage, and if it starts to decline on the inside, you might think about dividing it. Here we've got a good plot of a hosta, so we're going to dig this up and go ahead and divide it. Now when you're digging hostas, you want to make sure that you're not digging right close to the crown of the plant. We're going to dig a little bit further away, depending on how big, but maybe 5 or 6 inches away from the crown of that plant so that we can ensure that we're getting a large root ball to divide. So this hosta, you can see as I dug up that huge clump, it actually kind of broke into 3 separate clumps as I was pulling it up out of the ground. And so it kind of makes me think that maybe it was like what we were talking about earlier, how they planted 3 plants close together to create that large clump. Now, of course, these are sizable individual clumps, 3 clumps. So we're going to go ahead and divide this up even further. You can see in some situations where they naturally have broken apart, and you can almost just go ahead and separate those with your hand and have a nice plant there to use somewhere. You can see we've got some smaller eyes coming on here. But in a situation like this, if you've got your spade out, you don't need to go find a handsaw. You can actually just use your spade to divide that plant. So you can see we've taken what was one plant that covered about a square foot of maybe 3 feet. We've divided that into 8 separate plants now that we can either scatter throughout our garden or make an even larger clump of this guacamole hosta. Remember, hostas are easy to divide like ornamental grasses. You just go in there and cut them apart. They're pretty tough plants, and it's a great way to get multiple plants out of one.
Hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.